Hello, Modonauts. So I have been meaning to do a particle modifier tutorial for quite some time. And initially I was going to do a tutorial on particle modifiers in the context of using them as elements for motion graphics, where you'd create some cool sort of moving elements, kind of like MoGraph in Cinema 4D, and then you bring them into After Effects and do some work with those. And maybe I'll do that again, but I think I'm going to touch on some of those aspects in this tutorial. But what I really want to show is how to do some really cool images that have been popping up in the gallery that are based on work by Lee Griggs, who has been doing his work in Maya and Arnold using XREFs in Maya, which bear some similarities to pMods and replicators in MODO. And I just love this kind of work. It's just really cool. These are the type of images you only ever really see done on a computer. And you'll notice that we've got some, he's just using a simple prototype, just a cube that's been scaled on the Y and some places on the X and the Z, and he's got some colors in here. And we're going to actually make an image like this, and we'll show you how to, or me, I don't know who we is, the royal we, I don't even know what that means. I will be showing you some ways to do things like, here you can see the scale here. These are scaled in the Y, but they're also scaled down in X and Z. Over here, these are just scaled up in Y, or maybe these are scaled up in X and Z, but more in Y. You have colors at various altitudes, but also the color changes along the length of these as well. And in some of these, at least, it appears that there's a fair amount of color variation even at the same height. So, there's a lot going on in these images to make them sort of really subtly interesting and cool. In fact, let me zoom in a little bit. You can see all the different sort of greens and almost lavenders and blues in there, even at the same height, and some of the yellows. Some of that's coming from the lighting, but so we'll do a lot of work to try and make something as interesting as this, and at the end of the day, you're going to have a much better understanding of pMods and what they offer. So there is that. So back in MODO, I'm just going to, I'm going to start really basic with pMods, and if you already know how to use them, maybe you want to jump ahead in the video. But let's just start at the beginning here. What is a pMod? A pMod is a particle modifier. And there's actually two kinds of pMods. One's a modifier, where it takes a particle source, whether from a particle generator, which are also placed in our pMods, or even a mesh as a point source, or a particle simulation as a point source, and then modifies it in some way, either by transforming it or sieving out, sieve or sieve. I'm going to say sieve. Sieving out certain aspects of the particles based on properties like height or things like that. You can add expressions and even control them with audio. So we'll touch on a lot of these things, but in general, let's just take a look at a particle modifier generator. And so the frustrating thing about pMods, I think one of the reasons people haven't done a lot with them, it seems like, is they're not very intuitive. And right off the bat, you'll see if I click on particle generator, I get this locator in the viewport, but that's all I get, right? I see that there is an array, 4x4x4 particles being generated at this length. But I see nothing in the viewport. There's no OpenGL representation of these particles that are being generated right now. So they exist in MODO here, but you just can't see them. So that's kind of a bummer. And I think deters some people from really exploring how these work. So you have to use a replicator at this point to view what's going on with the particle generator. So if I drag this down to the schematic, and I've got an empty mesh container here, so just clicking on the model, pop up and holding control, I can throw a unit cube there. We'll just do that for now. And drag this guy down, and we'll just name that prototype to make it easier to remember what that is. I always like my cameras and lights at the top of the list for some reason, so just dragging that down. And then we'll add a replicator. And if you are familiar with MODO, you probably use replicators all the time. But if you don't use them, you can get them over here in the item list. Item, replicators, add replicator. You can also right-click over here in the viewport and right-click and do create particle replicator. And of course, in the item list, same thing, create particle replicator. Now I've got a replicator. You see it's grayed out because I've got nothing in the prototype or point source. And you can fill in these here. Like I can go prototype and point source, but I'm actually going to do this in the schematic because we're going to be doing a lot of schematic work here. And I want to just throw this down in the schematic so we have it down here to manipulate. You'll see right off the bat, now we've got something. Okay, now something interesting is happening. And I'm going to hide my prototype there just so we have these bounding boxes, right? So replicators by default show up, geometry shows up as a bounding box, but if you press O, and in the viewport under drawing and control, we can say replicators all. And since we're just using cubes and just a small number of particles, I think performance-wise you're fine showing replicators in the 3D viewport using OpenGL. Now if you're using some really complex prototype or millions of particles, you probably don't want to show them as anything other than bounding boxes. But this is going to be easier for us to view what's going on here. So let's look at some of the properties of this particle generator. We've got count and length. So I'm going to grab length X and Z. In an item mode, if you press C, that's channel haul, and just start dragging. And we're going to drag this out until these cubes finally separate, right? In fact, let me turn on a wireframe so you can see what's going on there. We can do it in Y too. Go over to Y and start dragging this out, and they're sort of separating. And so that's it, right? That is the essence of a particle pMod generator. Is you're creating, in this case, an array of particles which are feeding into a replicator as a particle source, and of course the prototype is being placed at each one of these guys. And now there's a number of options here that we can use to create. Like I said, initially I want to do a motion graphics tutorial, so I'm going to show some of this stuff real quick, but eventually we're going to get to the cool stuff. So right off the bat, let's just change Y to 1. And you'll notice that if I look at a side view, I'm pretty far below the 0 area. And so let's put Y at 0 here under the length, and to center our array at 0. And now if I double tap escape, boom, boom, you'll notice I both dropped the tool, the channel haul tool, and also deselected the particle generator. So if you don't use the escape double tap method in MODO 1,000 times a day, you're missing out. So escape double tap will drop a tool and also deselect anything in the scene. So that's a good thing to do. But I'm going to reselect the particle generator, and I'm actually going to hide it. I don't need to see that locator there. It's sort of, in fact, just by default, I think it should be off as well, because I think it doesn't really add anything to the scene. So a couple things. Let's just take a look at this a little bit. Now I do have transform properties here on my generator. So I press them in item mode, and just I can move it around. I can move this particle array around, right? So I'm moving around the array, and in the viewport. So I can do that. I can also move around the replicator in the viewport, right? So I'm moving around the replicator, However, if I add another replicator, we just go to particles, replicator, I've got another one at 0, 0, 0. And if I do the same thing here, add a particle pMod there and the prototype here, you'll notice that, these are still at the center because this particle generator hasn't changed. I'm just moving around this first replicator. So the particles are still here, right? Again, this is just kind of annoying because there's no OpenGL representation of the little particles. There's no little dots in the screen. It's a thing to be careful of, just because you can actually, like I said, translate the particle generator because it has transform channels. You can also transform the replicator. So here, this replicator's at, I've moved it around a little bit. Well, this replicator is still at 0, 0, 0, and the particle generator is at 0, 0, 0. But if I start moving around the particle generator, I'm now moving around the base of particles, and this second replicator is offset, and well, this one's 0. So I'm just letting you know that don't start moving around your particle generators unless you know what you're doing, or your replicators, again, unless you know what you're doing, because these transforms will start affecting each other. So let me grab them all and zero them out. 0, control, enter, of course, puts them all at the same value. I'm going to delete that second replicator there. The other thing I just want to make a note of, if I turn my prototype back on, again in item mode, if I start moving my prototype around, these transforms in scale or rotation or whatever are not feeding up to the replicator. The replicator is just taking the initial values here. And so you're not going to see any of these changes propagating up to the replicator. So if I, for instance, wanted these cubes smaller, I don't want to do the transforms in item mode. I want to do them in poly mode. So let me go back to 0 here. Control 0, control enter, and same thing, 0, control enter. Scale 100, control enter. One thing I could have just done there is really easily is select these guys and said restore or set up rest value. That would have brought me back to 0, but anyway, so we're back at 0 here, and I'm going to keep my prototype active. But I'm going to go to poly mode, or you just press 3 to go to poly mode. And if I start manipulating the polygons in poly mode, those of course will propagate up through the replicator there. So if you want to change the scale, so to speak, of your prototype, do it in poly mode, not in item mode. Just undo that. One thing you have to be careful of, though, is right now, if I hide my replicator, you'll notice that, just go to item mode, you'll notice this little, in the setup viewport, centers are visible by default. So whoops, hide that item there. So we've got a center there. It's in the center of, turn my grid on, it's in this 0, 0, 0, right? We're at 0, 0, 0 at the item level. But if I move my polygons off center here, I'm gonna turn the replicator back on. If I move these guys off center, that will, of course, go up through the replicator. So again, this is sort of deceiving. It looks like my whole particle array is moving over here, but it's not. My particle array, again, I can't see them, my particle generator, there's no OpenGL representation, but they're all still right here. I've just moved the polygons over here. In fact, the center of my prototype is still here. I've just moved the polygons over. In fact, if I create like a cylinder here, I can hide that guy, but let me drag him down here and change out the prototype, you'll see my cylinder is right here because that's where the particle generator particles are. They only appear like they're over here because I've offset my polygons from the center, right? So you need to keep your polygons centered unless you really know what you're doing in terms of moving them off center. So you can always make sure they're centered. You go over here, center selected, put them back at the center. Okay, so let's hide our prototype and delete our cylinder, and now we're back here. Hide our particle generator. Okay, so those are some just gotchas like I like to show in some of these videos so you don't start confusing yourself right off the bat. We're trying to create an image like this, right? And so in order to do this, I need to talk about some of the other pMods over here that we can insert into our chain of events. And I'm going to start with a random pMod and just select that guy and drag him into the schematic. And so this is sort of a cumbersome way of inserting it. You can create it and then manually hook it up, feed the particle generator into the particle source, and then feed the output of this random pMod back into the replicator. And you see we've got some randomization going on in the translation of the cubes. So the other way to do this, which isn't quite as cumbersome, we just delete that and go back to where we started, is I can select this middle link here and then click on the random pMod, and it inserted it in between. Now, of course, if there's a bug where it's not visible, and I have to double click one of the outputs here to bring it up, but that's a little bit easier than doing it the other way. All right, so you may be asking yourself, Replicator has all kinds of randomization parameters. Why would you use a pMod random modifier or a particle random modifier? And the reason is you have a lot of control over the randomization, doing it in a chain like this. First of all, you have a range. So right now, let's just make this sort of easy to view. We are randomizing the Y position from -4 to 4, right? Because this is going to take this 4 and it's going to look at the range and it's going to do it from -4 to 4. It's going to apply it to each one of these particles this particle generator is generating, and then Replicator will place a cube at each one of those positions. If I change this range min to 0, now you'll notice that we're only in the positive direction on Y here, where we're just doing a random position from 0 to 4. There's a nice apply channel as well, or if I just channel all this down, I can apply that randomization over time if I want to. So there's some really nice controls over here on the particle random modifier, not the least of which is also a slot for a fall off. So I can add a fall off. Let's just add a linear fall off into the mix here and drag this down into the schematic. And I'm going to, before I hook this up, I'm going to make this a little bigger, let's say range 4, and connect this to the fall off slot of the random modifier. And here you'll see if I move this way, so it's sort of aligned right here. So this is, the fall off is going this way, so the pMod is applying that random range, these values, right? Whoops. That up potential -4 value is being multiplied by this fall off. So on this side, that particle is, the fall off is at 0%, so you're getting 0% of that potential random 0 to 4 value, all the way up to 100% on this side of the fall off, right? So if I move the fall off this way, they all get it 100%, and this way they're getting it just a little bit. Now they're not getting it at all. So you can see the particle random modifier, and a lot of these modifiers, pretty much all of them really, have a fall off slot in there. So that is really useful. There's some other ways we can do control the randomization though, not just with a fall off. All right, go back to perspective view here and selecting this little connection between our generator and a random modifier. I'm going to add a Sieve Modifier, and you can see that I lost half my particles. And what is the deal with that? So the sieve is going to have a set of parameters that defines which particles I keep. So right now, if the particle ID is less than 0.5, I keep it. If I say less than 1, I'll be keeping all of them. If I say less than 0, I will be keeping none of them. So let's take a look at this, less than 0.5. And so that is sieving out half my particles. So the particle ID, of course, is normalized between 0 and 1. That's why we're at a value, a decimal here, and not 1 through 16. We can also take a look at some other parameters here for the sieve. So the sieve can do all kinds of things. It can sieve particles based on positions or velocities, forces, colors, particle source, fall off, which is really interesting, which I may show, but emission rate, age, whatever. So there's all these different parameters that can be the sieve can use to decide which particles to keep from the particle source that's being fed. In this case, we're keeping just half of them. Now, if I want to keep the other half, it's really easy. I can just add another particle sieve. So let me grab another particle sieve, and here this guy is. And I'm going to feed in the same particle generator as a source. And this time, instead of saying particle ID less than 5, keep them, I'm going to say particle ID greater than 0.5, and I'm going to keep them. So let me unplug this here and plug this back into the particle source. And so that's the other half of the particles, right? So we've got those particles, and that's all of our particles. What's interesting, though, is we can randomize these guys here, and I can add another random modifier. So I'm going to add in this random modifier right here. And so for my other half of my particles, I'm going to plug in my particle sieve into the particle source. And these guys, instead of randomizing position, I'm going to leave that at 0 so those don't get moved. I'm going to randomize the scale, okay, at 150%. You want to do uniform scaling. So I'm going to plug this into the replicator just to take a look. So I've got some I have some randomly scaled items here. Maybe let's just do 30%. And over here, I've got some items that were moved up with the particle random modifier. But right now I've got two different streams of particles happening. And what's cool with pMods is you can aggregate those using a basic pMod. And so we'll just drag in our basic pMod. And all this does is accepts a particle source or fall off as well if you want one. And it applies some translation values if you want to translate it or scale it or rotate it. But I just want to sort of combine these two together. So I'm going to bring in this as a particle source. I'm going to bring this as a particle source. I'm going to bring this back to the replicator, and now we've got some randomly scaled, half our particles are randomly scaled, and the other half are randomly moved up. So you can see, I can also take this linear fall off and move this into, any one of these. I'll just throw it into my scaled guys, and so you can see if I move my linear fall off here, and you can, translate this guy. So you can see the scale happening there, right? I could bump up my scale a little more, I think. This 75, and so I'll grab my fall off. So we've got all kinds of ways to select particles with fall offs and sieves and apply different random transformations to them. And we can even apply those transformations or animate them over time. So there's a lot more control in a set of pMods than just taking the replicator and applying some random transformations at the end of the line here. We're splitting our chain of particles into two chains. We're doing different kinds of randomizations on them, and then merging them together again before feeding them into the replicator. So we're even adding a fall off in here to work with the random scale. So you start to see the power of this a little bit, right? It's starting to make sense what we can do with pMods and how we're going to use these tools to wind up with something cool like this. You can see how we can start splitting up our particles in our array, doing some different randomizations to them, and then merging them back together at the end of the day. So that's our next step. So I think that's enough of a sort of refresher or crash course on pMods. Let's get on to making something cool.